It was a Friday night in one of those places where the ceilings were high enough for chandeliers, but the lighting was low enough to make the leather booths glow like secrets. The restaurant wasn't just expensive, was exclusive, the kind of place where the wait list stretched weeks into the future, where the napkins were pressed with more care than some people ever received in their lives, and where the staff knew that a single wrong move could end a career. That night, the air hummed with the clinking of crystal glasses and the deep, practiced laughter of men in suits who didn't need menus because they always ordered the same thing. Power had its habits, and habits had their rituals, and this place was built for them. In walked Jonathan Mercer, a man whose name was whispered with a mix of awe and resentment across Wall Street and Silicon Valley alike. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was the billionaire, a CEO whose decisions could cause thousands of people to lose their jobs before lunch and make millions more before dinner. He had the kind of presence that made rooms bend toward him, not because he was loud, but because he carried the weight of someone who believed the world bent to his will. He arrived with no entourage, no assistant, no bodyguard, just himself, his tailored charcoal suit and the air of a man who already owned everything he could see. The Mater D nearly bowed when he recognized him, ushering him past the line of waiting guests as though parting the sea. At the far corner of the dining room, in a booth that gave him privacy but ensured he could see everyone else, Mercer sat down. He didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the curious glances, didn't smile. He simply rested his hand on the table, checking his watch as though time itself owed him punctuality. When the waitress appeared, he barely lifted his eyes. Her name was Maya to the restaurant. She was just another waitress in crisp black and white, but she was more than that. She was the one who remembered faces, who noticed details others missed, who could tell within 5 seconds whether a table would tip well or not. She had grown up watching people underestimate her, first as a young black girl in a small town, then as a young woman putting herself through college with 2 jobs while people assumed she'd never go far. Now, she carried herself with a kind of grace that came from knowing her worth, even if others didn't always see it. When she approached Mercer's table, pad in hand, she didn't flinch at the aura that seemed to ripple off him. "Good evening, sir. Would you like to start with something to drink?" she asked, her voice even and professional. He glanced up at her for the briefest moment. His eyes were sharp, calculating, the kind that always seemed to be scanning for weakness. Then he looked back at the menu he didn't need. Whiskey, neat, Macallan, 25. Maya nodded, writing it down though she didn't have to. The bar already knew his order. He had been here before, though not often. He wasn't a regular, but he was memorable. She stepped away to place the order, her mind flicking back to the rumors she'd heard about him. The man who never married, who was too busy conquering markets to settle down. The man who donated millions to causes one day and cut pensions the next. The man who was both admired and despised, sometimes by the same people in the same breath. When she returned with his drink, setting it gently before him, he finally looked at her properly. "Steak, rare, and make sure it's the Wagyu," he said, his voice low, almost bored. "Of course, sir," she replied, jotting it down, and that was supposed to be the end of it. Another table, another night. But something about the way he looked at her lingered, not in the way she had learned to guard against, not the leering stare that too many women in service knew all too well. This was different. His gaze was piercing but distant, as if something about her face had reminded him of something or someone he had long tried to forget. For a second, his expression faltered just slightly before he masked it with that cold detachment again. Maya noticed. She noticed everything, and as the night went on, she found herself watching him too. In between her other tables, in between the endless rhythm of wine refills and bread baskets, he barely touched his drink, barely glanced at his phone, barely acknowledged the room. He sat there, waiting for his steak, waiting for something else, as though this dinner was more than a meal by the time the steak arrived. Sizzling and perfect, the room had settled into its late evening rhythm. Deals were being toasted, anniversaries celebrated, secrets whispered across linen. Maya set the plate before him carefully, the knife and fork aligned just so. He gave the faintest nod. She turned to leave, then hesitated. There was a moment, brief, but heavy, when she saw not the billionaire CEO, but a man with tired eyes, with a shadow in his gaze, with something restless in the way his fingers tapped against the table. And in that moment, something in her told her she had to act. Later, she would try to explain it to herself, that it wasn't impulse, that it wasn't recklessness, it was instinct. The kind that comes from carrying unspoken truths too long, from knowing when silence is a betrayal. She slipped a small piece of folded paper from her apron pocket, the kind she sometimes used to scribble reminders or orders when her pad was full. With a quick, practiced movement, she set it beside his plate, as though it were nothing at all, as though it were simply part of the service. Mercer looked at the note, then at her. For a heartbeat, the entire restaurant seemed to still. His fork hovered in the air. His chest rose and fell once. Sharply, he picked up the note with deliberate slowness, unfolded it, and read the words written in neat, steady handwriting. And in that instant, the man who believed nothing could shake him, nothing could touch him, nothing could stop him. For a long second, Jonathan Mercer didn't move. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background, the laughter, the music, the hum of conversations, all of it blurred into static as his eyes scanned the short, simple message on the folded slip of paper. There weren't many words, but the weight of them landed with the force of a hammer. Do you ever think about the people who built your empire? The ones you never saw? That was all it said. No name, no plea, no explanation. Just a question, handwritten in a way that was both steady and personal, as though it had been rehearsed, carried, and finally set down at the exact right moment. Mercer's jaw tightened, and for the first time in years, his hand trembled ever so slightly as he folded the paper back into its crease. He slipped it beneath his plate, as though hiding it could undo the fact that he had read it. But the words echoed in his mind, louder than any boardroom confrontation, sharper than any headline about him. He picked up his knife and fork, cut into the steak, and chewed slowly, but it was as though the flavor had evaporated. His meal tasted like nothing. The whiskey sat untouched, the ice melting in the glass. Across the room, Maya carried on as though nothing had happened. She poured wine at another table, laughed softly with a couple celebrating their anniversary, moved with the practiced grace of someone who had mastered invisibility. But Mercer felt her presence like a beacon. He told himself it was absurd. She was just a waitress, a stranger. What did she know of him, of his empire, of the decisions that had built it. But the note didn't read like a guess. It read like a truth spoken aloud for the first time. Mercer prided himself on control. Every negotiation, every hostile takeover, every quarterly report, he lived by precision. Nothing caught him off guard. Yet here he was, a man worth billions, undone by a slip of paper from a waitress who barely looked 30. Minutes stretched into hours. He lingered, longer than he usually would have, watching her weave through the dining room. At last, when the check arrived, he signed it, without glancing at the total. He left a tip larger than most people made in a week, but he didn't leave the note behind. He slid it carefully into his jacket pocket as though it were contraband, and rose from the booth. On his way out, their eyes met. Maya didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the note at all. She simply said, "Have a good evening, sir," with the same tone she used for every guest. But Mercer knew it wasn't every guest that night. In the penthouse suite of a glass tower overlooking the city, Jonathan poured himself another drink and sat alone at the wide desk where so many decisions had been made. He pulled the note from his pocket and unfolded it again. The handwriting was neat, firm, deliberate. He stared at the words until they blurred, until they became not just a question, but an accusation. He thought of the factories overseas, the call centers, the warehouses, the endless stream of names and faces he never bothered to learn. He thought of the quarterly reports where numbers told stories of growth, but never spoke of the people behind them. He thought of the faces he had passed by in boardrooms, in lobbies, in airports, faces that had looked at him with both awe and something else, something heavier. For the first time in years, he wondered if the empire he had built wasn't made of steel and glass and money, but of lives stacked on top of each other, lives he had never once considered, and he hated that it had taken a stranger, a waitress, to force that thought into his mind. The following evening, he returned to the restaurant. The staff buzzed quietly when they saw him again. It was unusual for someone like him to come 2 nights in a row. He requested the same booth, ordered the same whiskey, the same steak, but this time his eyes followed Maya the moment she appeared. When she approached his table, he stopped her before she could speak. "You wrote that note," he said, his voice low, flat, but edged with something he rarely allowed anyone to hear: vulnerability. Maya's eyes flickered, but she didn't deny it. She met his gaze, steady and calm. "Yes, I did." "Why?" She hesitated, glancing around the room as though weighing whether to answer here, in the heart of his world, or to walk away. Finally, she leaned slightly closer, her voice quiet, enough that only he could hear. Because sometimes people need to be reminded of what they've forgotten. Mercer sat back, studying her as though she were an equation he couldn't solve. No one spoke to him like this. Not his executives, not his investors, not the politicians who courted his money, and certainly not a waitress, but she had, and against his better judgment, he found himself wanting to hear more. Jonathan Mercer leaned back against the leather booth, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. The question hung in the air between them, heavier than the chandeliers above. And though Maya had answered, he sensed there was more. He wasn't used to this being the one in pursuit of explanation. Usually, people tripped over themselves to tell him what he wanted to hear. But Maya's calmness, her deliberate restraint, unsettled him more than outright confrontation ever could. Reminded Of what, exactly? He asked finally, his tone sharper this time, as though pressing her for details would help him regain control of the situation. Maya straightened, adjusting the tray against her hip. Of the people you don't see, she said simply. Then, with practiced grace, she excused herself to attend to another table. Mercer watched her walk away, irritation prickling beneath his skin. He was not a man accustomed to half-answers, yet something in her voice steady, almost gentle made him hesitate to call her back. He had learned long ago that in negotiations, silence was as powerful as words. And so, against his instincts, he let the silence grow. Throughout the evening, he found himself distracted, unable to focus on anything but her. Every time she passed, he studied her movements, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, the way she smiled at customers without ever losing herself in the role, the way she seemed utterly unfazed by him. He wondered what her story was. Most people who crossed his path had agendas. She didn't seem to, and that made her dangerous. In a way he couldn't quite name. By the time dessert menus were offered, Mercer broke his own rule and stayed longer than usual. He declined the menu, of course, but waited until Maya returned to clear the table. As she stacked the empty plates, he lowered his voice. "You've worked here long." The question startled her, though she didn't show it. "Long enough," she replied, sliding the silverware onto the tray. "That's not an answer." She paused, then looked him directly in the eyes. 2 years before that. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who didn't want to be asked one." The remark landed like a dart. Mercer almost smiled, though it was more reflex than humor. "Fair," he conceded. Then, after a beat, he added, "Most people don't hand me notes like that." "Most people don't need them," she replied evenly. The words hit him harder than he expected. There was no malice in them, no raised voice or accusation, just fact. And that, somehow, made them impossible to dismiss. When he finally left that night, he carried her words with him the way he had carried the note the night before. He thought about them in the car, staring out at the blur of city lights. He thought about them in his penthouse, where the silence echoed too loudly. He thought about them lying in bed, unable to sleep, the sheets feeling colder than usual the next day. Instead of heading straight to the office, Mercer found himself researching the restaurant staff roster. He had the power to know anything about anyone, and information was his weapon of choice. But when he tried, he hit a wall. No public profiles, no details, nothing beyond a name. Maya Ellis, a ghost in the digital age. It bothered him, not because he felt entitled to her story, but because she had flipped the script. She had seen him more clearly than he had seen her, and for once he realized he wanted to earn the answer rather than extract it. On the third night, he returned again. This time, the staff no longer buzzed with surprise. They treated him like an emerging regular. Maya approached with her usual calm professionalism. "Back again?" she asked lightly, setting down the water glass. "Seems so," he replied. Then, after a pause, "If I keep coming back, will you eventually tell me why you wrote that note?" Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him as though weighing his sincerity. Finally, she said, "Maybe, but only if you're willing to hear it, really hear it, not just listen the way powerful men do." Mercer blinked. "And how do powerful men listen?" "They wait for their turn to speak," she said. They filter everything through what benefits them. They don't actually sit with the discomfort of someone else's truth. The honesty in her voice startled him. No one spoke to him like this. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on hers. Then try me. For the first time since their strange connection began, Maya's expression shifted. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction at gaining his attention, only a quiet, almost reluctant resolve, as though she hadn't planned to open this door but now felt compelled to. "My father worked for one of your companies," she said softly. "Not in an office, in a warehouse. Night shifts, long hours. He gave everything he had because he believed it would keep food on our table and help me get through school. Then, one day, the contracts changed. Benefits were cut. Overtime disappeared. And people like my dad, people who'd built your empire with their hands, were treated like they were disposable. He got sick, and we couldn't afford the treatment anymore. He's gone now." The words hit Mercer like a blow to the chest. He had heard stories like this before, of course abstract accounts, filtered through reports, PR teams, and angry articles. But this wasn't abstract. This was sitting across from him, with eyes steady and unflinching. Maya didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply told him the truth, stripped bare. And in that truth, Mercer felt something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. Real, raw, uncontainable. For a long time, he said nothing. He didn't know what to say. And that, more than anything, terrified him. The restaurant buzzed around them, but Jonathan Mercer barely noticed. Maya's words had landed like stones at the bottom of a still pond, rippling through him in waves he couldn't stop. He had faced angry investors, hostile journalists, even government hearings, but none of that had left him this shaken. A single waitress, with a steady voice and a quiet gaze, had broken through the armor he had spent decades perfecting. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "I'm sorry," he muttered, though the words felt foreign, awkward, like they didn't belong in his mouth. Jonathan Mercer didn't apologize, ever. But in that moment, stripped bare by her honesty, there was nothing else he could say. Maya studied him, her expression unreadable. "Sorry doesn't change anything," she said, not cruelly, but as if stating a fact. "It doesn't bring my dad back. It doesn't undo what happened to hundreds of other families." Mercer winced. He had expected pushback, but not the calmness of it. Rage he could handle. Anger he could dismiss. But calm truth was different. It clung. It sank in. It stayed. "I didn't know," he admitted quietly. "About him. About your father." "Of course you didn't," Maya replied. "That's the point. Men like you never know. You build towers so high you can't see the ground anymore. And when people down here fall, you don't hear the sound they make when they hit." Her words cut deeper than he expected. He had always told himself the same story, that the system was harsh but necessary, that sacrifices had to be made, that numbers didn't lie. But hearing it from her lips, framed not in profit margins but in human loss, stripped away all his excuses. He sat there for a long moment, staring at his untouched plate. The steak had gone cold. His drink sat half-finished, condensation pooling on the table. He realized, with a start, that for once in his life he didn't care about appearances. He didn't care that others in the restaurant were glancing at him, wondering why the great Jonathan Mercer looked so unsettled. All he cared about was the fact that Maya had forced him to see something he had spent years avoiding. Finally, he asked, "Why? Tell me. Why not hate me? Why not just ignore me, like everyone else does?" Maya's gaze softened, though her voice stayed firm. "Because ignoring you doesn't change anything either. And hate just eats the person who carries it. My father didn't raise me to live with hate. He raised me to speak truth, even if it shakes people. Especially if it shakes people." Mercer felt something twist inside him. He didn't want to admit it, but he envied her. Her clarity, her courage, the ability to look him in the eye and say what no one else dared. He thought of the boardroom filled with sycophants, the endless meetings where people nodded along to everything he said, the press conferences where reporters asked sharp questions, but always from a safe distance. None of them had gotten to him the way she had. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. He stayed longer than he needed to, his mind circling her words like a moth around a flame. When he finally left, he didn't retreat into his usual armor of detachment. Instead, he carried the weight of her story back to his penthouse, where the city lights glittered beneath him like a kingdom he no longer trusted. That night, sleep refused him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing her words echo again and again. "You build towers so high you can't see the ground anymore." He thought of the warehouses, the night shifts, the rows of faceless workers whose lives had fueled his empire. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his fault, that it was the system, that it was economics, that no one man could carry it all. But the excuses felt hollow now. For the first time in years, he didn't believe his own lies. The next morning, his reflection in the mirror startled him. He looked older, more tired. The sharpness in his eyes had dulled, replaced with something he couldn't quite name. Was it guilt, regret, or was it the beginning of something he had long buried? Conscience. At the office, his team noticed the change. He sat through meetings, but barely spoke, his mind wandering. He signed documents, but didn't read them. Numbers blurred on the page, meaningless in the shadow of Maya's words. His assistant asked if he was feeling well. He brushed her off, but deep down, he knew he wasn't. Something inside him had cracked, and there was no patching it up. By evening, he found himself walking back into the restaurant. He told himself it was coincidence, habit, curiosity, but the truth was simpler. He needed to see her again, needed to hear her voice, needed, in some strange way, to be held accountable. Maya greeted him with the same calm professionalism as always, though this time there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or expectation. "You came back," she said softly. "I did," Mercer replied. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "I don't know why." "Maybe you do," she said gently, before walking away to fetch his drink. And as he watched her move through the dining room, Jonathan Mercer realized something that unsettled him more than any hostile takeover ever had. He wanted to be seen. By her, truly seen. Not as the billionaire, not as the CEO, not as the untouchable figure everyone bowed to, but as a man, flawed and broken, desperate for some kind of redemption. Jonathan Mercer was not a man who returned to the same place without reason. His life had always been a straight line. Decisions, outcomes, profits. Everything was calculated. Everything was measured. Yet here he was, sitting again in the same booth night after night, with no explanation that satisfied even himself. The Mater D and staff treated him with practiced reverence, but Maya never changed. She didn't fuss over him, didn't offer false flattery, didn't bend the way others did in his presence. Instead, she treated him like any other customer, except that her eyes lingered just long enough to remind him that she saw straight through him. That evening, after she poured his drink, he surprised himself by speaking first. "I keep thinking about what you said," he admitted. His voice was low, almost a whisper, about towers, about not seeing the ground. Maya's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained professional, and she asked, "And I don't know what to do with it." The confession left his lips before he could stop it. He was Jonathan Mercer. He didn't admit uncertainty, yet the words slipped out as though she had unlocked a door he hadn't realized was there. Maya set the bottle down, folding her hands for a brief moment on the edge of his table. "The first step is admitting you stopped looking. Most people never even get there." Her calmness unsettled him again. She spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through pain and come out the other side, not unscarred but unbroken. Mercer envied that strength. "I've spent my whole life chasing growth," he said slowly, as though testing the words. "Every decision, every deal, it was all about making the company bigger, stronger. I told myself it was progress. I told myself it created jobs, opportunities. But when I think about your father," his voice faltered, "when I think about him, I don't know if I believe that anymore." Maya didn't rush to fill the silence. She let his words hang, heavy and unpolished. Finally, she said, "Growth isn't bad. But when growth comes at the cost of people's lives, it isn't progress. It's just greed dressed up as success." The truth in her words hit him like a blow. He wanted to argue, to defend himself with the usual language of economics and necessity, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she said it, not with venom, but with clarity. Or maybe it was the gnawing voice inside him, the one that had been silent for years, now growing louder by the day. He took a long sip of his whiskey, but the burn did nothing to dull the ache in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt small, not in the way of losing power, but in the way of realizing he had misunderstood power all along. That night, when he left the restaurant, he didn't go straight home. Instead, he walked past the glittering shops, past the glowing towers he partly owned, past the city that bowed beneath his name. He walked until the streets grew darker, narrower, quieter, places his drivers usually avoided. And there, in the shadows of the very empire he had built, he saw them, the workers leaving late shifts, the exhausted faces, the silent burdens. He realized he had built a world where these people were invisible to men like him. By the time he returned to his penthouse, his chest was heavy. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and scrolled through reports. Numbers, graphs, charts, all meaningless now. He closed the screen with a snap, and instead unfolded the note Maya had given him that first night. He read it again, slowly, as though the words had grown sharper with time. "Do you ever think about the people who built your empire? The ones you never saw for the first time?" He answered the question aloud to the empty room. "No, I didn't, but I should have." His voice cracked on the last words, startling even himself. Over the next week, Mercer found excuses to return. Sometimes he sat in silence. Sometimes he and Maya exchanged only a few words. Other nights, their conversations ran longer, circling around truth and responsibility. She never pushed too far, but she never let him off easy either. Every answer she gave forced him deeper into questions he had avoided his entire life. One evening, she asked him directly, "What would you do differently if you could?" The question froze him. He had spent decades looking forward, never backward. Regret was a luxury he didn't allow himself. But now, faced with her steady gaze, he couldn't escape it. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I don't even know where to start." "Start small," she said gently. "One decision at a time, one person at a time. That's how empires are built. That's also how they're healed." Her words haunted him long after he left. They weren't grand or dramatic, but they carried a weight that felt more real than anything he had ever heard in a boardroom. Days blurred into nights, and slowly Mercer felt the ground shifting beneath him. His empire hadn't changed, not yet, but he was changing. The note, the conversations, the truth he couldn't unhear it, was as though Maya had cracked open a window in a suffocating room. And now he couldn't go back to the stale air he once thought was enough. But change, he knew, came with a cost. And the question that kept him awake now wasn't whether he could change, but whether he was brave enough to pay that cost. 4 days after their last conversation, Jonathan Mercer moved through his world like a man haunted. His office, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison lined with glass and steel. Meetings he once dominated now felt hollow, the voices of his executives reduced to background noise. Charts and figures slid across the conference table, profits rising, shares climbing, but instead of satisfaction, he felt a strange emptiness, like winning a game he no longer wanted to play. The question wouldn't leave him. What would you do differently if you could? For the first time, he realized he couldn't hide behind the armor of inevitability. He couldn't say it was the system. He couldn't pretend his hands were clean. Maya had forced him to see that behind every decision there were faces, real faces, faces like her father's, faces he had erased without even knowing their names. Late one night, sitting alone in his penthouse with the city glowing beneath him, he opened his laptop and pulled up a file most CEOs avoided looking at: the labor reports. Rows of numbers detailing wages, benefits, hours. He scrolled past them, faster at first, then slower. Then he opened the HR records, scanning termination notes, sick leave requests, appeals denied. Every line was a reminder of the people his empire had swallowed whole. For hours he sat there, reading, until the words blurred. He saw his father's face in his memory, stern and hard-working, a man who had built his fortune from nothing. But he also saw Maya's father, a man who had given everything and been left with nothing. 2 fathers, 2 legacies, one built on the ruins of the other. By dawn, he had made a decision. The following week, Mercer shocked his board of directors. At a quarterly meeting, while investors beamed at the record profits, he set his papers down and said, "We're changing course." The room went silent. "We're restructuring wages, increasing benefits, restoring overtime, effective immediately." The words dropped like stones. The board erupted: panic, outrage, disbelief. "Jonathan, are you out of your mind? This will cost billions," one shouted. Another barked, "The shareholders will revolt." But Mercer didn't flinch. For the first time in years, he felt clear. If the shareholders want to revolt, let them. We'll make less profit this quarter, maybe the next. But if we can't take care of the people who built this company, then we don't deserve the profits we make. The arguments raged for hours, but Mercer didn't back down. He was used to fighting for what he wanted, only now, for the first time, what he wanted wasn't more power, but something resembling justice. News spread quickly. Headlines blared. Billionaire CEO slashes profits to boost workers' pay. Analysts called him reckless. Some called him a hero. Stock prices wavered. Employees whispered in disbelief. And the media scrambled to make sense of the man who had always been the embodiment of ruthless capitalism, suddenly turning into something else. But Mercer didn't care about the noise. He cared about the faces, the warehouse workers, the call center employees, the janitors who cleaned the glass towers at night. For the first time, he was looking at them not as numbers, not as costs, but as people. That night, instead of retreating to his penthouse, Mercer found himself once again at the restaurant. Maya approached his table with the same calm demeanor, but this time there was something different in her eyes. She had seen the headlines. She knew you did it, she said, softly, setting down his glass. I don't know if it's enough, Mercer admitted. It won't bring your father back. It won't fix everything. Maya looked at him, her gaze steady but gentler than before. It's a start, and starts matter. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then Mercer asked, almost reluctantly, "Do you forgive me?" Maya's expression shifted, surprise, then thoughtfulness. Finally, she shook her head slightly. It's not my forgiveness you need. It's the people's. It's your own. My father, he's gone. I can't speak for him, but I can tell you this. He would have wanted you to change. Not for him, for everyone still here. Mercer swallowed hard, his throat tightening. For years, he had measured success in billions. Now he realized the true measure might be something far less tangible: respect, decency, humanity. In the weeks that followed, Mercer's changes rippled outward. Factories that had been ghost towns of exhaustion began to hum with cautious hope. Workers received paychecks they hadn't thought possible. Healthcare plans returned. For many, it was still not perfect, but it was more than they had dared to dream. Critics said it was a stunt. Rivals called it weakness. But for the first time in decades, Jonathan Mercer didn't care what they said. He cared only that he could look in the mirror and see something resembling a man again. And through it all, he returned to the restaurant, not for the steak, not for the whiskey, but because Maya had become something he had never allowed himself before: a conscience with a voice. One evening, as she set down his usual drink, she said quietly, "Funny, isn't it?" "What is?" he asked. "How a single note can change everything." Mercer looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "No," he said softly, "not funny, necessary." And in that moment, he realized that the empire he had built was no longer the one he wanted. He wanted something different now, something his billions had never bought him: the chance to be human again. Months passed, and the storm around Jonathan Mercer refused to quiet. Some called him a visionary, others branded him a traitor to his class. Wall Street grew restless, politicians lined up with questions, and newspapers filled with both praise and condemnation. But through the noise, something undeniable began to happen. Lives changed. Warehouse workers, who had once collapsed from exhaustion, now had enough staff on their shifts. Parents who had once chosen between medicine and rent now had health coverage again. Overtime checks returned to households that had gone years without them. The difference wasn't just numbers, it was food on tables, children with shoes that fit, families with hope they thought had been stolen forever. Mercer watched it unfold quietly. He didn't hold press conferences. He didn't deliver speeches. He simply kept making changes, one decision at a time, exactly as Maya had told him. Some days it felt impossible. Fighting against shareholders who demanded more, rivals who mocked him, and a system that resisted compassion at every turn. But for the first time, Mercer didn't measure his battles in dollars. He measured them in people. And every time doubt crept in, he found himself back in that corner booth, the slip of paper folded neatly in his wallet like a talisman. Maya never asked about his boardrooms or his battles. She never treated him like the headlines did. She served him water, poured his drink, and occasionally, when the timing was right, offered a sentence or two that cut deeper than any advisor's report ever could. One night, after another long day of clashes with investors, Mercer asked her, "Do you ever regret giving me that note?" Maya looked at him for a moment, her eyes steady. "No, I regret that it took a note to make you see, but I don't regret giving it." Her honesty struck him again, the way it always did, clean, unflinching, impossible to ignore. He realized she had never once sought anything from him, not money, not favors, not recognition. She had simply wanted him to see, to remember, to change. In time, others began to follow his lead. Competing companies, pressured by workers and emboldened by his example, adjusted their own practices. Slowly, like a tide turning, the industry began to shift. It wasn't perfect change, never was, but it was movement in a direction no one had thought possible for the employees who lived it. Jonathan Mercer became a name spoken with something approaching respect. For the wealthy elite, he became a cautionary tale, the billionaire who remembered the ground he stood on. For Maya, he was simply a man who had finally looked up from his towers and seen the people holding them up years later. When journalists asked him about the turning point, Mercer never mentioned boardrooms or market crashes. He never cited studies or economic forecasts. Instead, he would pause, touch the edge of his wallet where the folded note still rested, and say quietly, "Someone reminded me of what I had forgotten." He never named her. He never needed to. As for Maya, she didn't quit the restaurant. Right away, she stayed, finishing her studies, working her shifts, carrying her father's memory with her every day. But she carried something else, too. The knowledge that even the smallest act of truth could ripple outward in ways she couldn't have imagined. A folded piece of paper, slipped across a table, had stopped a billionaire cold and set in motion a change that reached thousands, and in that quiet truth was the lesson she hoped others would hear, that no voice is too small, no act too simple, no truth too fragile to matter. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to slip a note across the table. And the world, no matter how powerful, has no choice but to listen.